I burn for you. When next we meet, I wish only to be in your arms.
She had taught herself, over 10 years, to stand very still when it hurt. That discipline was the only thing keeping Sarah Ashford upright now. The ballroom at Ashworth House glittered with winter light, candle flame, and diamonds cold enough to resemble ice. Music had stopped only moments earlier. The dancers had parted with the soft rustle of silk and satin. And in the center of that polished floor, before half the county's most merciless observers, Edmund Vale held one of her private letters unfolded in his hand. His smile was civilized. That made him crueler. "I would sooner live my whole life beside his silence," he read, glancing up just long enough to let the words sting. "Than spend one honest hour in the company of a man who is easy but small." My dear Miss Ashford, I had not understood you capable of such feeling. A murmur traveled through the room. Someone laughed. Sarah did not. She stood in silver blue silk with both hands clasped before her, as though she had chosen to become the subject of the evening instead of being dragged into it. Her pulse hammered against her throat, but her face remained composed. She would not let London see her plead. The letter had never been sent. She had written it years ago and hidden it away like a sin she meant to outgrow. Now its lines hung in the air above her like a confession stripped of privacy and mercy both. Edmund lifted his brows with false sympathy. One hates to think how long such devotion has been suffered in secret. That was when Hadrian Vance, Duke of Ashworth, crossed the floor. He did not hurry. A man of his rank never needed to. The room made way because it understood power when it saw it. Tall, dark, and composed in formal black, he moved through the candlelight with the terrifying calm of a man who had already chosen what must happen next. He stopped beside Edmund and extended one gloved hand. "Give me the letter." Edmund tried to smile. "Your Grace, I meant only—" "The letter!" This time there was no mistaking the threat beneath the softness. Edmund surrendered the page. Hadrian folded it once, very precisely, and turned to Sarah. For one suspended beat, the room seemed to vanish around them. She saw the storm-gray steadiness in his eyes, the anger he had not allowed anyone else to witness, and something more dangerous still, regret, stripped bare. Then he offered her his hand. "If society means to make a spectacle of Miss Ashford," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence, "it will do so while remembering that I am the man concerned." No one moved. No one breathed. Sarah looked at his hand and then at his face. 10 years of restraint stood between them. 10 years of wanting him, misunderstanding him, excusing him, and resenting him for the same silence she had once praised as strength. The room waited for her humiliation to deepen. Instead, she placed her hand in his. If stories like this are what draw you in, the ones where quiet hearts survive long enough to be seen, stay with Quiet Fires of America and let the fire burn a little longer. To understand how Sarah Ashford came to stand in that ballroom with her private heart exposed to strangers, one must go back to the winter road and to the accident that finally did what 10 years of good breeding had failed to do. It forced truth into the open. Sarah had been 28 that January, old enough for the world to treat her composure as proof that she no longer wanted anything. Her father's estate had never fully recovered from her brother Julian's death 6 years earlier. Since then, Sarah had become the quiet center holding everything together. She wrote letters to solicitors, soothed tradesmen, calmed servants, and found ways to reduce visible ruin into respectable inconvenience. It was useful work, invisible work, and because she performed it without complaint, other people had come to believe it cost her nothing. Hadrian Vance had known better. That was part of the problem. He had first come regularly to Ashford Court when Sarah was 18 and Julian still alive. Still laughing, reckless, adored, and determined to restore the family fortunes through clever partnerships no one older and wiser trusted. Hadrian, 12 years Julian's senior, had been his friend, patron, and occasional rescuer. He had also been the first man Sarah had ever met who did not mistake gentleness for emptiness. He listened when she spoke. He noticed details. He never flattered, never trifled, never seemed in danger of losing control of himself. It had been very easy, therefore, to love him. It had also been hopeless. He was a duke. She was the daughter of a struggling gentleman with too many quiet scandals tucked under the rugs. He moved through rooms as though born to command them. She moved through them, restoring what other people had damaged. And when Julian died, after becoming entangled in a failed investment involving timber contracts and disputed transport accounts, Hadrian changed. He became more formal, more absent, more generous in practical matters, and colder in every other way. Sarah had not understood it then. She only knew that grief had taken her brother, then distance had taken the Duke. The invitation that placed them in the same carriage years later came from Lady Agnes Vail, Edmund's widowed aunt, who had decided to host a winter gathering at her estate near Ashworth Lands. Sarah had not wished to go. Her stepmother was long dead, her father inattentive, and society had settled her into the harmless category, reserved for unmarried women who seemed too sensible to be romantic. But her father insisted she attend. "You cannot spend another season buried in ledgers," he said, with the guilty tenderness of a man who benefited daily from her burial there. So she went. Hadrian was already among the invited guests. The knowledge sat inside her like a hidden fever throughout the journey. By the time the carriage turned onto the narrow road crossing the Ashworth Wood, the sky had gone from white to iron gray. Snow thickened. The coachman muttered about the weather. Sarah kept one gloved hand tight around the strap of her traveling reticule and fixed her eyes on the blurred landscape beyond the window. Opposite her, Hadrian sat with the same impossible stillness she remembered. A scattering of snowmelt darkened one shoulder of his coat. His face, sharpened by winter light, gave nothing away. "You should have remained in town," he said at last. She looked up. "Because of the weather?" "Because Agnes Vail gathers people the way some women gather knives, for display." Something in her almost smiled. "And yet you accepted." "I had estate business nearby." "Of course." There was enough history in those 2 words to warm the carriage for an hour. He heard it. She knew he heard it, because his eyes lifted to hers and stayed there one moment too long. Then the wheel broke. There was no graceful warning, one violent crack, then the savage lurch of a carriage losing its balance on ice. Sarah threw out a hand. The world tipped, glass shattered, horses screamed. Weight and wood and snow seemed to collide all at once. When the motion stopped, she was half pinned against the seat, dazed, tasting blood where her lip had split. Hadrian was already moving. Sarah! It was the first time he had said her name, without title or formality in years. Are you hurt? My hand, she whispered. He forced the twisted door open against the drift. Wind hit them like a wall. One groom had been thrown clear and could not stand. The coachman shouted that the axle had snapped clean through. There's a hunting lodge less than half a mile east, Hadrian said. Can you walk? She nodded before she was sure. He helped her down into the snow, one arm steady at her waist. She would remember that crossing for the rest of her life. The storm in her face, the ache in her hand, and the Duke beside her, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body, while propriety disappeared beneath necessity. The lodge stood dark among the trees, until a lantern flared within. Its keeper, Mrs. Beatrice Holt, opened the door before Hadrian could knock twice, and ushered them in with the brisk authority of a woman who had long ago stopped being impressed by rank during weather emergencies. Storm'll keep you here till morning at least, she declared. Maybe longer if the drifts keep rising. Maybe longer. It should have alarmed Sarah. Instead, it seemed at first like the kindest sentence winter had ever passed. The lodge was simple. Stone hearth, narrow stairs, sturdy table, the smell of wood smoke and old wool. Mrs. Holt sent the servants to settle the injured groom and pressed hot broth into Sarah's hands. Hadrian stood across the room, removing his gloves with deliberate fingers, as if control could be restored by attending to small tasks. Your hand, he said quietly, when Mrs. Holt went to fetch bandages. It is sprained, I think. He came toward her. She should have drawn back. She did not. His touch was careful as he examined the swelling. He had large hands, disciplined hands, hands meant for reins, pistols, signatures, power. Yet they trembled slightly when he saw the bruise beginning to rise along her roof.
You ought to be angry with me, he said. The intimacy of the remark startled her more than the pain. For the weather? For putting you in this carriage at all. You did not put me anywhere, Your Grace. His mouth hardened at the title. Night drew around the lodge. The storm did not ease. One by one, the layers of proper distance that had protected them for a decade began to thin under the pressure of firelight, fatigue, and the simple impossibility of pretending indifference in a world reduced to 2 occupied chairs beside one hearth. They spoke first of ordinary things, roads, repairs, the injured groom, then of Julian. That name changed the air. Sarah set down her cup. I have always wondered, she said, looking into the flames because she could not look at him, whether you stayed away after my brother died because of your grief, or because you had discovered mine was inconvenient. Silence met her. Then Hadrian said, Neither. She turned. He stood at the mantel with one hand braced against it, his profile lit by fire. For the first time in years, he looked not grand, not remote, but tired. When Julian died, he said, I learned 2 things within the same week. First, that I had loved the wrong kind of risk in him, and encouraged it because I thought I could contain the consequences. Second, that if I remained close to Ashford Court, I would eventually ask you for something I had no right to ask." Her breath caught. The room seemed to narrow until only his voice remained. "You were 18, he said. "You had just buried your brother. Your father leaned on you for more than he ought, and I was 12 years older, already in possession of everything the world values in a man: rank, land, influence. If I had reached for you then, even honestly, I would never have trusted myself not to make your grief serve my desire." Sarah looked at him as though she had never seen him before. All those years she had told herself 100 versions of the story. He did not care. He had noticed and chosen duty over tenderness. He had pitied her. He had forgotten her. Not once had she guessed that the distance had cost him too. "You might have spoken to me later," she said, and the softness of it hurt more than accusation. He closed his eyes briefly. By the time later arrived, silence had become the only honorable thing I knew how to do. She laughed then, but only once and without mirth. "Honor is a cold companion." Yes. That one word held more loneliness than any speech. The confession should have settled nothing. Instead, it opened everything. Over the next day, while snow sealed the lodge and the servants worked below stairs, Sarah and Hadrian moved through rooms that seemed charged by all the years they had not touched. He read while she mended the tear in her glove. She found him watching her and did not look away. At supper they spoke of books and harvest failures and the absurdity of Lady Agnes's guest lists. In the silence after midnight, they spoke of wanting. It was Sarah who asked the most dangerous question. "Did you know?" she said from the doorway of the small parlor where he had spread estate papers across a table. "About me?" He did not pretend not to understand. "Yes," he said. "For how long?" "Long enough to hate myself for being relieved." The candlestick between them threw trembling light across ledgers, maps, and his face. "And you?" he asked. She could have lied. She had become very skilled at surviving by elegant omission, but the storm had broken something open in her that no drawing room could mend again. "For 10 years," she said, "which is mortifying enough that I should prefer not to hear your pity." Instead of pity, he crossed the room. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "Sarah," he said, her name roughened now beyond recovery, "I have built half my life around not touching you." Then he kissed her. It was not reckless. That was what undid her. It was restrained even in hunger, a kiss shaped by years of denial and the terrible discipline of a man accustomed to refusing himself. Her hand rose to his coat. His settled against her waist as though it had always known that place and had been starving for it.
When he drew back, neither of them spoke. The fire shifted behind them. At dawn, the storm began to break. Reality returned with the road. So did danger. The first note reached Sarah the evening they arrived at Lady Agnes's house, after the roads were cleared. It was folded without seal and left among the flowers in her chamber. "I possess letters in your hand, and accounts that would make the Duke very attentive. Leave Ashworth Circle at once, or I shall let society judge how a lady trapped him before the storm ended." There was no signature. Sarah read it twice, then a third time. Fear came first. Anger followed so swiftly it almost steadied her. She burned nothing. She hid the note instead. The next morning, Edmund Vale appeared at breakfast with lazy charm and too much interest in whether she had slept. Sarah had known him for years as the sort of polished man who weaponized laughter. Now, she saw calculation under every gesture. Her certainty deepened 2 days later, when she found among the papers Hadrian had carried to the lodge a copied transport ledger bearing a name she had not expected to see again. Amos Wren, the former estate accountant who had managed the timber contracts connected to Julian's final business venture. Julian had died after a fall from horseback, returning from a meeting he should never have attended alone. The investment failure that followed had been explained as rash optimism, youthful folly, bad weather, unfortunate timing. Sarah had always believed the story incomplete. Julian, careless in some things, had been meticulous in figures. He would not have signed what the accounts later suggested without leaving himself some line of retreat. Now, here was Wren's name again, linked to papers crossing between Ashford and Ashworth interests. She went cold. That evening, she confronted Hadrian in the library. He read the note. His face altered with each line until all warmth vanished from it. "Did Edmund give you this?" "I cannot prove it, but I think he is involved." Hadrian stared into the fire a long moment. "There are ledgers missing from Wren's final quarter. I have been trying to trace them for months." "You said nothing." "I had nothing certain enough to burden you with." "Do not decide for me what burdens I can bear." The words landed. She saw them land. He exhaled slowly. "Julian discovered irregularities shortly before he died," Hadrian said. "He sent me a note saying he believed someone had been moving transport charges between accounts to disguise a private speculation. He meant to bring me proof. He never arrived. Wren disappeared within the year. Edmund Vale has since attached himself to several houses whose books do not reward close inspection." Sarah's grip tightened on the back of a chair. "And you tell me this now?" "Because until now, I had no reason to think the blackmail and Julian's death were joined." "But you do now?" "Yes." She was silent a long moment. Then, very quietly, "You retreated once in the name of honor. Do not do it again in the name of protection." He looked at her as though she had reached inside him and found the exact weakness he had hoped to conceal. For 2 days they worked together. Sarah searched Julian's old memorandum book, which she had brought with her out of habit more than hope. Hadrian sent for copied books from Ashworth offices. Mrs. Holt, summoned from the hunting lodge on the pretext of checking on the injured groom, confirmed that before the carriage left, a gentleman's servant, she later identified as Edmund's man, had been seen near the dispatch case and wheel irons. It was not enough for a magistrate, but it was enough to see the shape of the truth. Edmund had obtained Sarah's private letters from a locked escritoire at Ashford Court during a summer visit years earlier. Lady Agnes, eager for gossip and alliances, had protected him. Amos Wren had used Julian's good name to shift losses into Ashford records, and had then fled when discovery loomed. Edmund, finding later that Sarah preserved copies of household accounts and Julian's notes, had first courted her information with charm, then attempted to frighten her into silence when he realized she could connect the books. The carriage sabotage had likely been meant not to kill, but to isolate, unsettle,
and compromise. Instead, it had trapped her with the one man he least wished near her. When Hadrian understood the full ugliness of it, he did exactly what Sarah had warned him not to do. He turned cold. Not cruelly. That would almost have been easier. He became formal, with surgical precision, as if each word passed through law before reaching his mouth.
"I will deal with Vale," he said in his study the morning after they assembled the evidence. "You will return to Ashford Court for the present. Quietly." Sarah stared at him. "Quietly." "It is the safest course." "For whom?" "For you." "No, for your conscience." He flinched, almost invisibly. She stepped nearer, all the ache of the lodge turning sharp inside her. "You think if you dismiss me now, if you seal this up behind your title and your lawyers, then whatever we said in that storm can be filed away with the rest. But I will not be handled like another difficult estate matter." His face tightened. "If Vale publishes those letters, then they publish. You do not know what society can do to a woman." Sarah laughed softly, bitterly. "Do you imagine I have reached 28 without learning?" That broke something in the room. For 1 second she thought he might come to her. Instead he stepped back, and because he did, she understood at last that love without courage could wound a woman almost as deeply as indifference. So Sarah left him standing among his ledgers, and went to do what he had failed to do. She chose action. If men preferred to think strategy belonged naturally to them, she had no obligation to preserve the illusion. She returned first to Ashford Court, where invisibility served her better than rank ever had. The housekeeper admitted her to Julian's old room. Behind the false back of a writing cabinet, Sarah found what her brother had once mentioned, and she had forgotten in grief: a packet of copied figures, transport tallies, and a brief memorandum naming Wren, 2 altered shipment dates, and E.V., beside an amount large enough to ruin 3 families. From there she went to Mrs. Holt, who repeated her statement before a solicitor Hadrian trusted, but had not thought to involve on Sarah's terms. Then Sarah interviewed the coachman herself and drew from him, not by intimidation but by patience, the fact that a payment had been offered if he would say the wheel failed from age rather than tampering. Finally she requested, through the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, an invitation to the great winter assembly Hadrian intended to use for quiet damage control. If Edmund meant to ruin her in public, she would choose the room. The ball blazed with light on the night everything ended. Sarah entered alone. That fact caused almost as many whispers as her gown. She wore silver blue, the color of frost under moonlight, with no unnecessary ornament. She did not look like a woman begging readmission to favor. She looked like someone who had made peace with risk. Across the room she saw Hadrian go still. He had not expected her. Good. Edmund approached within minutes, smooth and smiling, sensing opportunity. "Miss Ashford," he said, bowing, "how brave of you to appear." "How careless of you to assume I would not." His eyes sharpened. The musicians shifted into a new set. Lady Agnes moved nearer with several attentive listeners in tow. Sarah knew exactly what they meant to do. They wanted spectacle disguised as concern, exposure framed as moral disgust. Edmund obliged them. He drew the folded letter from his pocket and lifted his voice just enough. "There are declarations one should not commit to paper where they may be misunderstood." Several heads turned. Sarah felt the room gather, and then the scene returned to the place where it began. Edmund read. Laughter brushed the edge of the crowd. Sarah stood still. Hadrian crossed the floor.
When he took the letter from Edmund, she saw at once that this was not the same man who had retreated from her in his study. Something in him had been burned clean. Perhaps fear had done it, perhaps shame, perhaps the realization that protection offered without trust was only another prison in a better coat. He offered her his hand. She took it. Then, before he could speak further, Sarah turned to the room. "You are all welcome to hear the rest," she said. That stopped them more completely than any ducal command could have done. Edmund's confidence flickered. "Miss Ashford, I hardly think—" "No, let us have honesty for once." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. She withdrew from her reticule, a small bundle of papers tied in dark ribbon. Julian's memorandum, the copied ledgers, the coachman's statement, Mrs. Holt's sworn account. "My private letters would be of little interest," she said, "if the gentleman displaying them were not hoping to distract from something larger. 6 years ago, my brother discovered falsified transport charges linked to accounts passing between Ashford Court and Ashworth lands. Before he could bring the evidence forward, he died. The man who managed those books disappeared. The gentleman before you has since attempted to secure silence, first by charm, then by threats, then by theft, and finally
by blackmail." The ballroom had gone so quiet, the fire could be heard settling in the adjoining room. Edmund laughed, but it came too quickly. An imaginative tale, crafted, no doubt, to excuse a very inconvenient affection. Sarah met his gaze. "Then perhaps you will explain why your servant was seen tampering with our carriage fittings before the storm, or why you offered the coachman money to blame age for a cleanly cut iron, or why your own hand appears beside Wren's figures on the copy my brother concealed." She held up the memorandum. Lady Agnes made a faint choking sound. 2 gentlemen near the card-room stepped closer. One was the solicitor Sarah had engaged. The other was a magistrate who happened to owe the Dowager Duchess a very old favor. Now Edmund's face changed. Vanity gave way to fear. He looked desperately toward Hadrian, as though male negotiation might still rescue him from a woman's evidence. It did not. Hadrian spoke with killing softness. "You mistook my silence for blindness. That was your final error." The magistrate requested the papers. The solicitor supplied copies. Mrs. Holt, brought quietly to the house an hour earlier at Sarah's instruction, entered under the butler's guidance and identified Edmund's servant without hesitation. The coachman, already waiting in the steward's room, confirmed his statement when summoned. The scandal did not explode. It crystallized. That was worse for Edmund. Noise might have hidden him. Clarity destroyed him. He attempted one final sneer in Sarah's direction. "You would ruin yourself for this?" "No," she said. "I ruin only your belief that shame belongs naturally to women." It was the finest thing she had ever said, and she did not fully know she possessed it until it was spoken. The magistrate removed Edmund from the room with cold efficiency. Lady Agnes was left trembling behind her fan. Society, discovering which side of the event contained true power, rearranged its conscience with astonishing speed. Still, Sarah could feel the gaze of the crowd upon her, the curiosity, the admiration, the hunger for aftermath. She might have left then with dignity intact. A week earlier, she would have done exactly that. Instead, she turned toward Hadrian. He was already looking at her with an expression so unguarded, it made the whole brilliant room seem suddenly intimate. "I was wrong," he said, not loudly,
But the ballroom heard him anyway. "I thought distance would keep you safe. I thought if I carried the danger alone, I could spare you the cost." He stopped, and in that pause, Sarah saw the man he had been for 10 years and the one he was choosing to become. "All I did was ask you to bear it without me." No one in that room had ever heard the Duke of Ashworth speak like a man uncertain of his reception. That, perhaps, was why what followed became legend before the night was out. He took one step closer. "Sarah Ashford," he said, "I have loved you long enough to turn honor into cowardice and restraint into injury. I will not do it again. If you can forgive the years I wasted, let me spend the rest of my life being less afraid of happiness than I have been of scandal." A laugh trembled through her, half disbelief and half relief, so sharp it felt like grief leaving the body. "You choose a strange moment for courtship, Your Grace." "It seems I have always had poor timing where you are concerned." There was warmth in the room now, astonished and electric. Sarah became aware that she could still refuse him. That was important. He knew it too. Everyone did. So when he lowered himself, not theatrically, not absurdly, but enough that the gesture could not be mistaken, and asked, before all of them, "Will you marry me?" The power of the moment lay not in his rank, but in her freedom. 10 years earlier, she would have answered from love alone. Now she answered from something stronger. "Yes," she said, "provided you understand that I have no intention of being protected out of the truth ever again." The first real smile she had seen on his face in years appeared then, sudden and young and devastating. "I should be honored to be corrected for the rest of my life." The ballroom breathed again. Some laughed, some cried. Some hurried immediately to remember that they had always admired Miss Ashford. The Dowager Duchess looked as if she had personally arranged the moral architecture of the evening and found it satisfactory. For Sarah, however, the greatest miracle was much smaller. It was the feeling of his hand around hers afterward, no longer hidden, no longer borrowed from storms and accidents. Chosen.
There was scandal, of course. There were editorials, whispers, and more than one tight-lipped relation who found the age difference suddenly alarming only because the match had succeeded. Yet scandal, Sarah learned, had less power over a woman once she stopped agreeing to be frightened by its first approach. The inquiry into Wren's accounts widened. Julian's name was cleared of the recklessness that had been used for years to explain away crimes committed around him. Restitutions were made. Ashford Court, though never grand, became honest ground again. As for Hadrian, he discovered that marriage to a woman with a long memory and a better head for motive than most men of government was not a soft fate, but a glorious one. Years later, when the worst of that winter had settled into family legend, people still told the story of the Duke who had crossed the ballroom to claim the woman everyone else meant to shame. They told it because public gestures are easy to remember. But Sarah knew the truer story. Love had not begun in the ballroom. It had begun in silence and nearly died there. What saved it at last was not rank or weather or even longing. It was the harder thing, vulnerability, persistence, the decision to risk being seen, the courage to let love stand in daylight and answer for itself. And for that, every year of waiting had been worth the cost.